So if you want to actually edit an object, you have to switch modes, which is actually available up here. So right now we're in object mode, so all of our manipulations are done to the object. But if we want to edit the mesh, we need to switch to edit mode. You can also, if you turned on tab for pie menu, you can hold tab and you get up this little wheel, which gives you the same options. So you can see edit mode right there. So I can just hold my mouse over that and select it. That's how I prefer to work. So edit mode for meshes like this have three components. They have vertices, which are the corners. They have edges, which are the edges, and they have faces, which are the flat surfaces. And you can switch between these three modes, which one you're selecting up here. Edge mode, vertice mode, and face mode, or pressing 1, 2, or 3 on your keyboard. And all of the same move, grab, scale, and rotate tools work in these modes. So if I can take these two vertices, I can do a little box selection over them. I can hit G, and I can now move them around. I can also rotate these relative to each other, and I can change the shape of the cube. So you can not only just move things and rotate them around, or scale them up and down, you can actually do a whole bunch of different operations. And those operations are all listed here on the left. But if you have the preference set to turn spacebar action to tools, you can also just press spacebar and you get a list, along with their keyboard shortcuts, of all the different things you can do. And I would encourage you to play around with these. Chances are you're going to make a whole big mess, but that's part of learning what they do. So one of the fundamental ones is extrude, which is the shortcut E. So if I press E, I can actually extrude out a face, which has created 4 new faces and sort of lifted this one up. And I can keep doing that to add more and more different faces. So I can move this around and sort of manipulate the shape. Now this is where the X-ray mode comes in handy. Say I want to take this whole section here, but if I drag a selector on that, you can see the back one's not selected. So if I instead go into X-ray mode with Alt-Z and then drag select, I can see now all of them are selected, and I can now move it the way I was hoping to. So that's a very, very useful and very common thing you're going to be doing, is turning on and off X-ray in order to select through or not select through an object. So another really important thing to understand about not just Blender, but any 3D software, is the concept of scene hierarchy. And what do I mean by that? Well, if I create an object, this object has a position. So if I move it around, I can see it actually has recorded a location. And Blender records its units in meters. So if everything's a decimal of meters. And this defines a transformation from some point to this object. And if I reset it, it goes back to 0. So the origin of the world, which is where these cross axes are, essentially this object is defined relative to that position. But you can have objects that are sort of in a hierarchy. So if I create another, let's create a donut, the torus. I can actually parent these two objects together. So if I click Suzanne first, and then I shift and click this, as you can see, Suzanne is now this orange, and this is a yellow. Yellow is always the active selection, and orange is always the other selection. And you can see that reflected here. So if I do that again, I have another cube. I can select all 3 of these, but only one of them is the active selection. And you can see in the outline it has a brighter blue selection color. And that's really, really important to pay attention to what's the active selection, because a lot of tools will care about which is active and which is passive. For example, if I'm parenting. So say I want to parent these 2 objects to Suzanne. So I can hit Control P, and I have my set parent. So I can do a whole bunch of different options. I'm just going to do the first one, object. So now you see these little dashed lines are all heading to Suzanne. And as you can see in the outline, the other objects have disappeared. They haven't actually gone. They're just underneath Suzanne. So if I click Suzanne here, now if I move Suzanne around, these 2 objects come with. So that is, you can see that could be very, very useful as you start building up scenes to have objects that are like grouped together. But these individual objects are actually independent. And now these values here, if I reset them, so now these transform values are actually now relative to Suzanne. So if I move Suzanne around, these values don't change. So for example, let's say that's 6 meters on the x-axis. Now if I move Suzanne all over the place and I go back here, it's still 6 meters. And that is the sort of fundamentals of hierarchy, where Suzanne is actually parented to the world, so to speak. They're parented to this. You can think of them being parented to this grid on the floor, whereas these objects are parented to Suzanne. Now, you see this little dot here? That represents this object's origin, which is another important thing to keep in mind. Like this object is parented to Suzanne, the vertices on this object are sort of parented to the origin. You can think of it that way. So if I edit this, and I go into X-ray mode, so I can select absolutely everything, and I move it, as you can see, the origin doesn't actually move. I've just moved these things relative to that origin. And so this is important because if I create two cubes, I create one there, and then I create another one. Now, this is an important concept because the way that things are moved matters for a lot of the different tools that you're using. So, for example, this cube, its origin is actually centered about the middle of the box there. However, for this cube, its origin is actually still at the world origin, and all of its vertices over here. And as you can see, its transforms are actually all 0, because the transforms actually define where this point is, whereas on this one, you can see it's moved over by negative 1.5 meters. If I want to reset this to like sort of make this back to 0 but keep all of its vertices in the same place, I can do that by applying the transformation. That's what Blender calls it. In this case, you press Control A and you have your apply menu. This has all sorts of different options, but as you can see, you can apply all transforms, or you can just apply one of them. But if I apply all transforms, now its origin moves back to the center and its vertices are all here and it's all zeroed out. Typically, when you're modeling and making scenes, you want everything to be zeroed out unless you have a reason for it to not be. And that just keeps things tidy, makes things behave the way that you're expecting them to. So a really common beginner mistake is to take a mesh, and say you're building something out, and you move it around, you get it in place, and you're like, oh yeah, that looks good, and I'm gonna combine this with some other objects and build out. Maybe you're sculpting a character or something, but you've not reset the transforms. So now when you go combine it, your tool kind of does something wacky or unexpected or seems to be behaving very strangely. Double check that your transforms are all zeroed out, because that's usually the culprit. And you can just do that again with Control A and applying all transforms. A very important thing to note is how to save your files. It's very simple. You just go into the file menu and hit Save As. You can just put it, so I can do this as tutorial, and it'll save as a .blend file, which is then you can just reopen it and you get right back here. It will also by default save your user interface. So if you configured your panels in a certain way to work for that scene, that will also get saved with the file, which is typically what you want. But sometimes when you're downloading stuff off the internet, it can be a little bit annoying if all your windows are all wacky. So remember, you can reset your windows by going up here and adding back in some of the default workspaces if you open a file and it's all weird. So objects will appear differently depending if they're set to smooth shading or flat shading. And what do I mean by that? Well, it's very, very simple. If you right-click any mesh, and you can right-click it and go Shade Smooth or Shade Flat. And if you click between these, you can see the difference. In Shade Smooth, it kind of doesn't treat the edges of polygons as like hard edges. It treats them as like sort of a smooth kind of continuous surface. But then Shade Flat shows you every single little facet of the actual polygon. And here on this cyclorama, you can see the difference. Shade Flat gives you this like harsh stair-steppy look, but even though I only have a few spans between, if I shade smooth, it looks very smooth. So typically you're going to be working in flat until it gets to a high enough density that you want to see it in the smooth mode. So when working in 3D, it's always important to keep in mind what the scene or object or asset is meant to be viewed from. And so for a game, like what's the camera angle of the game? For a film, obviously it's the camera angle of film. So it's really important to keep in mind your camera. But how do you make a camera? Well, that's actually very easy. You just do Shift A, you can create a camera. And now a camera just exists like any other object in the scene. And by default, it puts it right on the origin, sort of the direction you're looking. Not usually useful. So what I like to do is I like to drag it up, position it sort of where I think it wants to be. Then I hit Alt-R to reset its rotation. And I rotate it one axis at a time. So I want the X-axis. And then I can sort of see it. Now, I want to be able to see what does the scene look like through this camera. So I can press 0 on the numpad. That's the insert or 0. And now I'm looking through the camera. And you can see this sort of grayed out area that's beyond the camera border. but this interior area is sort of the what the camera actually sees. Now, if I start to move, as you can see, I like leave the camera, essentially, which is sometimes you actually want to be like in this view and editing the camera. So I can actually shift and pan around, but I don't leave it. I'm just sort of panning off the edge of the camera, and I can also zoom in and out without leaving it. But the moment I rotate, I kind of exit. So say I want to actually like stay with it. So if I hit N to bring up our side panel here, there's a view tab, which has a whole bunch of different options for dealing with cameras. And one of the really useful ones is the lock here. I can lock camera to view. If I check this on, and now I move my camera, I'm actually moving the object, the camera object. And I can use this to position around, get the best angle of Suzanne here. That looks very stylish. All right. And now I usually always like to unlock it afterwards so I don't accidentally move my camera when I don't mean to. I can unlock that, and now I have my camera set up. Now you can have multiple cameras in a scene. So if I create a second camera, this can be very, very useful for, say you have a camera that's just showing details, and then you have your main camera where it's actually going to be viewed from. So if I swing this around, I'm going to just reset its rotation. I'm going to rotate it up on the x-axis. That's much better. And rotate it around on the z-axis a little bit, and I'm going to look through this one. But when I press 0, I went back to the first camera. In order to switch cameras, you have to go up on the outliner here, and you can see the camera icons next to these. There's a little selection on that one. So if I click the camera icon on this one, I'll make that my main camera. So now I'm looking through this, and I can play around and camera to view, and I can move this around and position it where I want it. And like all objects, there is usually a data property tab, which is the sort of specific to the type of object it is. So in this case, it's the camera data. And in here is where I can actually change my focal length, and I can like zoom it out, zoom it in, do a really telephoto kind of effect. I can sort of move it around, and there's a whole bunch of different options, including depth of field, safe areas, how it looks like in the viewport, all sorts of stuff. I'll leave that for you to play around with. So in Blender, we have two different ways of rendering, which is important to know because if you're doing things for film, you're often using the render engine called Cycles. But if you're just doing things that you want to render more quickly or they're designed for games, often using Eevee is a better choice to sort of preview things at a sort of faster but lower quality render. By default, I believe it's set to Eevee. So if you go under your Properties tab to render, you see it's on Eevee there. So Eevee is a very fast render. It's real time. I can actually move around my viewport while I'm in rendered mode. Works totally fine. But Cycles, on the other hand, you have to do a couple steps to get that working. First of all, usually you need a graphics card. If you just try to run this on just a CPU, your computer will cry. And under Preferences, you can go to System, and up here you have Cycles Render Device. So if you're a Mac, there will be Metal here. If you're on an AMD card, I think HIP is the one that you want. But if you're on an NVIDIA card and Optics is available, that's the one you want. And you're going to select your graphics card there. And Vulkan is the brand new API, but OpenGL works just fine. I'm going to just stick with that just so it doesn't crash. And you can change your render in here. So you actually have the workbench render, which is what the default viewport is. But we can also go to Cycles. And if you do this, you can see it gets very laggy. But it's actually doing a full like ray tracing render, and you get all this bounce light on the backdrop, which was missing from Eevee. That's one of the big differences between the two. And I could change my device here to GPU compute, so it renders much, much faster. There we go. I can look through my camera. And you can see Suzanne in all her glory. So those are the two main renderers. Typically, Cycles is for film and television, whereas Eevee is more for games or just when you don't really need Cycles and all the fancy lighting it has. Another important tip when you're working with Cycles is that you can enable denoising in the viewport, which is under your render settings. Denoise here. This can make it a lot nicer to work with. You can see it's a bit like smeary, but it's like I can actually understand the shapes. So depending on how you like to work, I personally use the denoising when I'm like configuring the lighting and trying to make sure it looks nice in the way I want it to before I go and do a full render with higher quality. Now, as you add more and more items to your scene, it's going to get a little bit disorganized. So it's always a really, really good idea to name all of your objects here in the outliner. So I'm going to name my spotlights. I'm going to name it my key light. And I usually do LGT for light. I can name that my fill light. And then I have Suzanne. I often call my geometry Geo. I can call this my cyclorama. And you get the idea. Keeping a naming convention is very, very good. Keeps things tidy and organized. You can also organize things under hierarchies, like we saw before. And a very common way you'll see this done is using something called empties. So if I do Shift-A and create a empty, it gives me a bunch of different options. You can actually change these after you've created it. So I'm just going to create plain axes. It just creates this little jack. Now if I move this around, it is just a sort of point in space. But if I look at its under N and then its transforms, it actually can record transforms including scale. And this sort of, you can think of this as an object without any actual object. So it records all the same information that Suzanne can record here with all of her transforms, except there's no actual mesh associated with this, which makes it very, very useful for building up hierarchies and grouping things together, because I can say, put this at our origin, and I reset it all. Now I can say, put my entire set under this. So I can click on all of my set items, which is my Suzanne and the cyclorama, and I can click on the empty. So the empty is the one in yellow, and I can do, what is it, Control P? Yes. Set parent to object, and I want to keep transforms because I don't want to actually move around the other two objects. I want to keep them where they are, just relative to this new point. And now this, my outliner is a bit tighter because they're now underneath this empty. And this empty can also be used to position the set around. So that's one very common way of organizing. Another very common way of organizing is using collections. So you can see by default, it'll have two collections. You'll have the scene collection, which is actually at the top level, and you'll have something just called collection. You always have to have a top level collection, but the regular collection is you can actually delete this or create others. And by default, any new object you add will be added to the collection that's selected. So if I collapse this, and as you can see, like the camera, it has that little like outline. And if I click on scene collection, I can actually select that. So now if I add something, say I add a cube, it's actually sibling to the collection. It's not in the collection. If I want to move it in the collection, I can actually just drag it inside. If I want to move it out, I can just drag it. I have to drag it down so that the black little selection goes onto scene, or I can actually just drag it onto scene. And maybe you had a whole bunch of objects that you wanted to sort of group together into a collection just to make them your outliner tidy. So if I create a whole bunch of objects, you can actually select all of them and say I want to move this into a new collection called props. I can hit M, which is move to new collection. Click new collection. I can give it a name called props and say create. And now I have a second collection called props. And these are very, very handy because they have, by default, a big checkbox here, which you can just completely hide it from the entire scene. Which is very, very handy when you have big scenes and it gets laggy. You can put things into a collection and then disable them so you don't need to look at them or have your computer lag as you're editing other things. So I would encourage you to play around with it, look up some tutorials, try things out, see what kind of features are in the program. This is a little scene I made for my film. And yeah, so I hope to see you in the Blender Club and have fun.